So it's my great pleasure to introduce our honored guest, Mieke Baal. Although I know that definitely all of you here in Zurich know her work, because otherwise they wouldn't have made it through this terrible weather and all corona restrictions, etc. But still, I will perform this ritual of welcoming and introducing you. So Mieke Baal studied French and literary theory in Amsterdam, received her PhD in French and comparative literature at the University of Utrecht, and, as she writes, ended up writing on the Hebrew Bible, Baroque and contemporary art, cultural analysis, feminism, and post-colonial thought. She has been a teacher of French at all levels early in her career, and later the founding director of the Amsterdam School for Cultural Analysis at the University of Amsterdam. Her concept of traveling concepts has traveled around the world, we can say. And of course, narratology, a book from 1985, has been translated in at least, I think, 6 languages. A key reference of transdisciplinary approaches, Mieke Baal has developed cultural analysis, allowing a critical perspective on the methods of the humanities. She has questioned traditional hermeneutics as well as art history's perspective on images and the separation of word and image, as in her book, Reading Rembrandt. And she has proposed different ways of doing theory in her epistemic as an aesthetic practice, not writing about artworks and literature, but exploring aesthetic practices beyond the theory-practice dichotomy. As a recent example, I want to mention Emma and Edward Looking Sideways, a book that accompanies an exhibition that Mieke Baal curated for the Munch Museum in Oslo, and which brings together Munch's paintings with the writings of Gustave Flaubert, especially Madame Bovary, which has in turn inspired a film by Mieke Baal and Michelle Williams-Schumacher. And today we will have the opportunity to follow Mieke Baal's image thinking, which is an ongoing project, in between words, images, and moving images, in her talk and the installation Don Quixote, Sad Countenances. So very happy to have you, Mieke. The stage is yours.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Dieter and Katerina. It's a great... I'm going to sit first, because an hour standing is a bit much. Can I... Am I sitting? More or less.
It's okay.
Yeah, it's okay. Thank you very much. Okay.
It's okay.
Yeah. Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. And at home, those who could not make it here, I hope you can hear me too. I'm very, very happy to be back in Zurich. It's not my first time. And I'm also extremely happy to have here the 5th full installation of that incredibly exuberant, ambitious project, Don Quixote, the Sad Countenances, which consists of 16 channels and 30 photographs. So I want to thank everyone who has made this possible, beginning, of course, with Dieter, but also Katerina, whom I met not so long ago in Sweden, and we had an immediate sense that we were on the same wavelength in this sort of fluid, but still rigorously to be explored, connection between art and thinking and knowledge. This exhibition that I hope you will see and enjoy later has been made possible by a fantastic crew of what Dominique called helpers, but I think they're just experts, dedicated and competent. Fernando, Dominique, Lisa, Emmanuel, and Matthew. They have been working yesterday through the day until in the early night, just before the storm started, I hope. When I woke up, I had this immediate, because when you're in a certain linguistic environment, I don't speak German and I apologize for that, and I don't really understand it, but the first word that came to my mind when I woke up was Sturm und Drang. That's bizarre, isn't it? Without having any knowledge of the language, there are some bits and pieces, like when I see Erkenntnis, I think of Habermas, Erkenntnis und Interesse. Very different from what we are doing here. So the question is, why bother? What's the point of making images called art for contributing to the production of knowledge and the spreading of knowledge? Specifically, in this case, Don Quixote. So I'm going to use this as an example because you have the opportunity to see it live, and that makes it a good case, because one of the things that aesthetic objects can do is make something concrete. So in addition to the challenge of taking on maybe the world's most famous novel, in the project Don Quixote Sad Countenances, 4 of my long-standing interests come together. And I will enumerate them quickly, but in counter-chronological order, which is consistent with my rebellion against chronological thinking. They are image thinking. Katerina already mentioned it. Image thinking, as I call it, something that I have begun to practice in 2002. And it is my alternative to artistic research, which I find a problematic concept because hierarchical, and we can discuss this. The second issue that I have always been interested in for a long time is trauma. Trauma, which became an acute issue in the 1990s when Holocaust remembrances became important, since most eyewitnesses were disappearing, with the result that cultural memory was theorized more. You still hear me okay? Okay. Then the third interest of mine is narrative, which is a semiotic mode, which has become my career-long specialization. And in spite of what people think when I started to make films, they thought, oh yeah, you've done enough books, you can now make films. No, it's another way of exploring this narrative. And then the fourth issue that comes together here is poetics. And I'm going to end up with a conclusion on that, poetics. The literary, which was the direction I took in my studies, my official discipline, but it's also something else. Yes, okay. So these are the 4 issues that I'm interested in. And as you can already see, and I will talk a little more about that, there is a physical resemblance between this actor and the image we have of Don Quixote, although the guy never existed. But his author did, and you see him there, and so there is something between the author and this actor. So, in Cervantes' novel, these 4 interests that I just enumerated join forces. Poetics, as creative and productive, is something like making. In literary studies, the term refers to the way the elements of a literary text come together, how the aspects of the text inflect the content, form inflects content, and produce effects on the reader. Narrative forms, events told, and figures, imagery, they all make the work. So the events told, the figures, the imagery, together, they cannot be separated. In the 2 senses of work, the text and what it does. The text is the work, and what it does is its effect. This making is the etymological meaning of poetics. With the sense of poetics, I find Cervantes' Don Quixote hard, almost impossible to read. I don't know if you have read it. You laugh out loud. There are very funny situations, but the laughing and the situations don't really match. The string of ongoing adventures and fantasies, interrupted by poems and inserted novellas, don't seem to amount to any kind of unified literary work. I have to say that I have read it several times now, but it never becomes a whole. Now, why is it so famous and such a smashing success then, if it has no form? Narrative it is, certainly. Of course, exuberantly, obsessively. From story to story, with a large number of narrators, yet also a central anonymous narrator, narrativity predominates. There are some poems, but narrativity predominates. Yet it does not congeal into a coherent form. And this was my incentive, the decisive challenge. If there is no coherent narrative, how can it be a novel? What is it then? And this became the challenge. Now, this wonderful Colombian literary scholar, Maria Antonia Garces, sensitized me to what I now call the novel's traumatic poetics. When I sat in some of her classes at Cornell University, she explained that the author had been captured, and this is common knowledge, it's historical knowledge, but I didn't know it when she told me, that the author had been captured and enslaved after a successful sea battle in which he lost the use of his left hand. So he lost his hand, but they won the battle. They went gloriously back to Spain, and the ship was captured, and the two brothers Cervantes were captured, and the rest went on to celebrate. And he stayed there for 5.5 years in slavery. Now, that explains something. After having been captured and enslaved, it suggests that he must have been traumatized, and that in that incurred traumatization, due to this long period of slavery without a sense of an ending, he must have become crazy. And the mad formlessness fell into place when she explained that. I said, oh, that's the traumatic poetics. So, when at the initiative of, and in collaboration with French actor Mathieu Montagnier, whose resemblance to the fictive figure of Don Quixote is so striking that people in the streets in Spain remarked on it. Although he was wearing jeans and a leather jacket, they said, hey, Don Quixote. And that is very remarkable. So he came up with the idea of doing a Don Quixote. And we decided to try and make a video work based on the world's primary best-selling novel. And the first bestseller, in fact, after the Bible and the Quran, the immediate decision was no linearity. Linearity is impossible. No feature film, therefore. So there is no feature film, as I had made with the other project, where I had installations and a feature film. So I had made these previous projects as what Freud called theoretical fictions, attempts to deploy fiction to develop a theoretical point. But for Don Quixote, no feature film, because that would betray the poetics of the novel. All films made on this novel betray its poetics by imposing a linearity that it denies. And of course, film as a medium is linear. Perhaps with the exception of Terry Gilliam's postmodern version from 2018, which, however, has the flaw of ridiculing the old man, and that's an ageism to which I particularly object. That didn't seem fair. But I also just don't think that that's the issue of the novel. But no wonder it is difficult to decide how to respond to this monument, this monumental novel, by making a video work. A gigantic challenge, something to which I'm slightly addicted. If there's no challenge, I don't really feel the enthusiasm to do the work. Now, the point of such endeavors is to learn something that is not to be learned from a book of theory. How can you learn something that is different? I'm not saying more or less, but that's different from what you can learn from a theory book. Now, as the term clearly says, image thinking is the activity of making images as a mode of thinking. And I have a book about this in press. This I wanted on the cover, but I'm not sure they will do it. This is a book that is going to appear in the spring of next year. And that activity is today mostly called, with a misnomer, in my view, artistic research. And Dieter mentioned it also with some skepticism. And the term I reject because it leaves the hierarchy between art making and theorizing, academic writing, visual and linguistic expression in place. Artists are supposed to do the thinking that is required for a PhD. Hey, and where's the creativity in the academics and in their writing? So it is also prescriptive, and prescription is contradictory to thinking, as Deleuze would say. Now, to grasp the interaction between Cervantes' words and images, Cervantes' words and our images, I turn to French philosopher Jean-François Lyotard through the best explainer of his work, David Roderick. So here you see Lyotard, and next to it Roderick, who has a lot of fun writing on Lyotard. His concept of the figural argues for language as dynamic. He turns it into a force, a movement, and this brings language closer to the Freudian unconscious in the interpretation of dreams than to any Saussure-derived structural conception of it, including especially force. That word force here, I think, is very important in his concept of language. Lyotard describes meaning as sense, in terms that include affect, sensation, and intuition, and also spatiality. Force, for Lyotard, is inherent in language, and it is nothing other, and I quote from this passage, nothing other than the energy that folds and wrinkles the text and makes of it an aesthetic work, a difference that is a form. And if it expresses, it is because movement resides within it as a force that overturns the tables of significations with a seism that makes sense. That also reminds me of the storm last night. Yes, that can have this force that goes beyond what we have in mind. Now, these words of Lyotard, of Roderick on Lyotard, paraphrasing him, these words affiliate language with specifically cinematic language, as long as this is based on the etymological sense of movement, rather than the technical specificity of analog or digital or whatever have you. Now, a first example to make this concrete. This is from a scene that I would recommend you watch later, and it's also in some photographs, and then also in a video called Narrative Stuttering. And watch it with keen attention, because this is where Cervantes explains to Don Quixote explains to the audience that he has around him in the inn, which he considers to be a castle. He is explaining the value of letters versus, fighting, war. Now, it is, like most of the videos, it's an 8 minutes episode in which Sancho Panza sits on the side with a script, helping him when needed as a prompter. So you see the prompter sitting, which you never see in a real theater. The knight is trying desperately to tell his story, the adventures, his opinions, whatever happened to him and those around him, but he is unable to act effectively as a narrator. So this central moment in a novel that is supposed to be a narrative is about not being able to narrate. At the end, he bursts into tears, and Sancho holds him in order to comfort him, demonstrating by physical touch that he is not entirely alone. This physicality of the interaction here is a primary point this ending of the episode is designed to make. But there is more happening here, as you will see. First, these two figures can do what they do because they have a space in which to do it, a stage. Hence, a fictional and visual one. The darkness deprives the space of perspectival depth, at times making Don Quixote almost seem to float, because you don't see the bottom of the stage, seem to float. And the stage isolates him, and at the same time gives him an audience. In line with this, I consider the theatrical setting as a material version of a theoretical fiction. And I continue every once in a while to use that term because I don't want to forget how Freud came up with it. It is material, but built as a theater. And once the figures are acting in it, it's a fiction. One that helps our thinking about, and in this case, the social issue of empathy. Freud came up with the term theoretical fiction to justify his fanciful, crazy story in his 1913 book, Totem and Taboo, of the sons who kill and eat their tyrannical father. Now, that is a fiction indeed, and he acknowledges it. But elaborating the story helped him with the discovery and elaboration of his most famous concept, the Oedipus complex, a theoretical advance in his thinking. In that case, the fiction consisted of a narrative. The sons rebel, they start to come together, and then they decide to kill the father. So this Freudian theorizing fiction is one genre of what I call image thinking. Others can be visually compelling, cinematic, poetic, such as some concept metaphor that make you think up new things. Now, in the scene from Don Quixote, the stage with its black floor suggests the potential of the theater to be affectively effective. This concerns disciplinary specializations within the humanities and the cultural practices studied there. The stage proposes a fictional space in which viewers can engage themselves, imaginatively going along with the fiction presented. And in this sense, the stage explores how theatricality can help to enable the narratively disabled. Now, here are two theorists I have learned a lot from. Theater scholar Katie Rutger, I think she's German, considers theatricality, quote, a specific mode of perception, a central figure of representation, and an analytical model of crisis of representation that can be traced back to changes in the material basis of linguistic behavior, cultures of perception, and modes of thinking. So that's a completely complicating way of seeing language. This multi-tentacled description gives theatricality many, many functions. It foregrounds its participation in thinking as well as in its inherent intermediality, which is a primary interest of the image thinking in my book, but also, of course, of theater as a genre. Theater and performance scholar Mieke, the other woman here, gives theatricality the critical edge that my video work, hence also the exhibition of which Narrative Stuttering is just one episode, seeks to achieve when she calls it a critical vision machine. So I want you to go and sit down and interact with the critical vision machine, with a thorough exploration of how that would work. Blaker demonstrates through detailed analysis, it's a wonderful book, how productive such a concept of theatricality can be for a political art that is not bound to a political thematic. Art is political, but not because it's about politics. Instead, it emanates political force in the sense of Lyotard's definition. Now, what Sancho was doing physically on the material stage that you just saw is what audience members are called upon to do, albeit without physical touching. You're not supposed to touch each other here, but you can interact. Such a call stems from the need of the narratively incapacitated figure in his theatrical setting, and by extension the likes of him in real life, for an empathetic audience. And it is remarkable that one of the central scenes in which Cervantes' narrator explains the importance of the things that we do, like reading and writing and making war, to do that through incapacitation. If such a call succeeds, the viewers can no longer be considered an audience with the connotations of passivity, but they become participants. Materiality, intermediality, and participation. These are three elements already that go to show that image thinking exceeds the limited view of fiction as unreal, irrelevant, and escapist, which is the old-fashioned view of fiction. Now, inviting an empathetic audience is a primary goal of this exhibition, in which trauma is a specific problematic we aim to work on and to work through. A working that involves thinking in the sense of creating something new, socially helpful, through being artistically meaningful. And for this emergence of empathy to be possible, a form of display is required that changes from the traditional museum display, which keeps audiences at bay. There is an important temporal aspect to this, which participates in the materiality of image thinking, and for this traditionally imposed mode of viewing governs the temporality of looking. The traditionally imposed mode of looking makes it necessary to walk on from painting to painting. In the theater, by contrast, people can sit, and if the display is nearby and accessible, and visiting can consist of quietly sitting, the museum becomes a kind of theater in this material sense. And this situation of the museum as theater is what makes art contemporary, for it compels spectators, visitors, participants to make the work, to make it work. The liveness of theater produces contemporaneity. The Don Quixote exhibition as a whole seeks to produce such material comfort for facilitating affective attachment in visitors, turning them into participants. So sit down and take the time is the rule, the golden rule for this. The consequence is a radically different temporality of the art experience. And in time, this turns out to be a factor of affect. These are images from the show that Katerina mentioned at the Munch Museum. Seating, benches, or chairs participate in the image thinking endeavor and become material thought images. This term is probably more known to you, the thought image. For time and its duration are the backbones of aesthetic experience. Discussing thinking with the actor Mathieu Montagnier, we got the idea that a video installation consisting of different non-linearly connected episodes might be effective in showing what is at stake, not the moment trauma occurs, but violence-generated traumatic states. And this brings us to that war-traumatized philosopher, Ludwig Wittgenstein. It seemed relevant that Wittgenstein's ending of the Tractatus, what you cannot say, you have to keep silent about, was modified later in a conversation of what one cannot speak, one can still show. I think that's a really fundamental change. The importance of showing is to enable witnessing, an engaged activity against the indifference of the world. Now, this scene is particularly relevant for my purpose. I'm still working on the same scene that is somewhere in this exhibition. It's particularly relevant for my purpose because it demonstrates the traumatic poetics without reference to the author's biography, although we know now about his little episode, this big episode. The knight errant is here trying to tell his war experiences in a recent comparison between arms and letters, a discourse the narrator or author calls curious, curioso. And this is the most argumentative, let's call it academic, episode of the novel. It is in that reasoning that the attempt to narrate flounders, dissolving into traumatic incapacitation. Narrative stuttering is the traumatic poetics of this episode, and in a way of the whole novel. Significantly, this is followed by the story of the captive, which is officially called Relato del Cautivo, where the trauma is retrospectively explained, autobiography is hinted at, and at the same time, as if in compensation, fiction becomes exuberant. It's 3 chapters, first part, chapters 39 to 41. Just take it up, and in 5-6 pages you have it all. Now, trauma. So, the knowledge about trauma that we try to distill from the novel into a new work that would be relevant for today, what is that? First of all, it is imperative to distinguish between 3 aspects of trauma. Its cause, the situation or state that cause produces, and the state of near powerlessness of bystanders. The distinction can be formulated succinctly as follows. Here you have it: violence, an event that happens; trauma, a state that results; and empathy, an attitude that enables. And you, as participants, visitors, are in charge of that last one. The subjects of these 3 facets are different. The violence has an agent, a culprit, a perpetrator. The traumatized subject is the victim of that, and the subject of empathy is the social interlocutor who can potentially help overcome it. The Don Quixote exhibitions aim to activate visitors to become such empathetic subjects. And the display, the way it's displayed, is meant to have performativity in this specific sense. Now, I hope that term performativity is known to you enough so that I don't have to go into it, but it's the effect of the speech. If the screens give you a speech act, you receive it, and it has effect on you. Now, between psychoanalysis and cultural analysis, Michelle Williams-Gamaker and I made a video project based on Françoise Davan's book Mère Folle, which deploys her theoretical fiction. It's a fictional story that develops her theory to argue with, not against, but a real discussion with Freud about the possibility to analytically help treat psychotic patients, most significantly the traumatized, who he alleges cannot be helped with analysis because they cannot perform transference. They cannot project on the analyst the causes of their trauma. Now, reversing the burden, Françoise Davoine claimed that psychosis, the madness resulting from trauma, is mainly inflicted by social agents. And that consequently, society has the duty to help. It's a sort of normal, everyday logic, right? You make someone ill, well, help them. And for this purpose, she revised some tenets of the Freudian method. And with great success. It's amazing that she attracts thousands of visitors, viewers, participants when she gives lectures in traumatized countries in Latin America, for example. Now, this is just a little bit of literature on trauma that I have found very, very useful. And the question is, how can we approach this challenge as ordinary social agents, not mental health professionals? How can we make knowledge enough to be able to help? In everyday life, images of violence are conducive to trauma are considered information. The news, right? You see it on the news. We take them in, we even get bored by their repetitive nature. Every day there's something, not even absorbing what that repetitiveness says about the world. And this is one way to consider Don Quixote's endless adventures. It's like the news. Every day something happens. And when you read it like the news, it is every day that something happens that is traumatizing. According to John Austin, it is better to change gears and consider such images not informative, but enhance their performativity. And this can result in a shift from activist art, which persuasively focuses on specific political issues, to activating art. The rationale of this shift that I proposed to implement, the rationale of this shift is the insight that the trauma and the powerlessness that result are not inherent in the violent events themselves, but they are a result. As analytical psychiatry has diagnosed and cultural analysis has studied, it is the impossibility to process, to even experience extreme violence that generates a trauma and obstructs its representation. So you see how I'm going back and forth between academic, intellectual, and artistic ways of dealing with this. Now here you see two images of a traumatized young man. Confusions and ethical problems threaten in attempts to show such horrid acts of violence. A solicitation of feel-good identification is also called trauma envy, which is a very cynical term, is utterly unhelpful and ethically problematic. As we know from Adorno's caution against it, voyeurism lurks. You know this, right? After Auschwitz, poetry is barbaric. Making poetry after Auschwitz is barbaric. It is less well known that he withdrew that later. But it's a whole other discussion. He withdrew it. He said, no, the traumatized, he doesn't use that word, but the victims have also the right to expression. Now, Françoise Davoine writes in her 2008 book, Don Quixote, Cervantes doesn't try to arouse visions of horror for voyeuristic readers. So she heeds Adorno's warning. One moment where violence occurs in our videos, the only one, is when a traumatized young man that you see here, Cardenio, acts out. But Cervantes' novel intimates this is a consequence of earlier violence that you also see happening. No, you don't see it happening. You hear about it. As an experienced expert, Cervantes understood trauma and made poetics through fiction, also meaning making, a narrative that discarded linear logic in favor of foregrounding the traumatic. Now, let me just give a few examples of image thinking that we did together in the making of this installation. Visually responding to the story of the captive. And this is not this story of Cervantes, of Cardenio, but this is a story of the slaves, including Don Quixote, in the possession of the father of this young woman, who herself is also a slave in the sense of not having the freedom. And I'm showing you a few photographs also to show you the quality, the artistic quality of these photographs in its production of knowledge of trauma. And I want to add that this Ebba Soons, this incredibly talented young woman, she was 22 or 23 when she made these photos. And she's now a practicing artist. And this shows things in the eyes of this woman, for example. You never see her eyes in the whole episode. This is as close as you get. But you see the bars of the prison. And the prison, of course, is her father's proprietarian, guarding her. So these are photographs by a young woman whose talent turns out amazing, and it's also, for me, important to show through these photographs the collective authorship in this project, because my name is on there, but there are all these other people who contributed and without whom it would never have been made. Oh, something is happening here, as we have a fantastic technician who can solve the problem. So, thank you. This is Zoraida, and Nafise Moussavi intensively enacts the role of the captive young woman as traumatized. This photograph is entirely adequately in its presentation both of the difficulty and the necessity to show trauma. You cannot represent trauma, but somehow in Wittgenstein's sense you have to show something that makes you empathetic. Ebba Soon's photography successfully avoids the traps of representation, the appeal to voyeurism, immodesty, censorship, its counterpart, sentimentality as a tear-jerker, and even as an incentive to trauma envy. I'm just mentioning the sort of well-known problems of the representation of something that really cannot be represented. The wish to appropriate the suffering of others and to feel good about it. The sense of repetition, trauma fatigue, oh, here we go again. And the narrative thrust that would overrule the image with its consent. That's also a danger. What happened to her? What happened to her before you see her here? And that is also a problem. So the details of the image are both telling and subtle. So they don't tell a story like a series of events. So take a good look. The half-open mouth of a young woman does not suggest screaming. The grain of the skin that almost merges with the hairs, the thin hairs in front of her ear, compel a close looking at the image. Her face turns slightly upwards, but not dramatically. Expresses a relationship to the outside that is not narratively explicit. Now, all this is very subtle and complex, and it shows something that cannot be shown. Now, I want to make the case for the difficulty. Why is it not working? I want to go to the next slide, but oh, sorry. So that's what I should do. Okay. I'm so clumsy with technology. So firstly, I want to make the case for the difficulty, even the impossibility to show trauma, yet the need to do so, to not show it as representation, but to show it in its performativity. The need, that is, to foreground and pay attention, to bestow empathy on something that cannot be represented. This also entails, secondly, an appeal to or a task for the viewer to not remain unaffected by the image. And that's you participants. But I also aim, thirdly, to strengthen the case that allegedly still images also move. And this is why my installations always comprise photographs, arranged in ways that make them seem closer to the moving images of the films, but it's not an illustrative connection. I don't put the video right in front of the photos. So it's up to you to recognize things that you see in the videos on the walls and in a different composition. And thus, in addition to the figural as the intermediate relationship between literature and images and film, in addition to the figural as the intermediate relationship between literature and film, I also seek to persuade my readers, my listeners, of the intermediality between photography or other still image media and film. There is an intermediate interaction, and you can see that when you are in the presence of both. And since movement also concerns the development of the willingness to act, a fourth goal, and that willingness to act comes from Bergson's discussion of the moving image, a fourth goal is to make the case for the political efficacy of art. And then the fifth goal is to recognize, I seek to recognize multiple authorship. Hence the focus on Ebba Soon's contribution in this case, but there will be a list of all the photographers. Now we go back to her, Zoraida. In the image, the state of trauma in which the figure Zoraida is caught shows in her gaze. Beyond craving liberation, she seems catatonic. So the image is stiller than still. The reflection in her eyes of the light that stands for the outside world comprises the bars in the windows that keep her inside. In this scene, which is the only moment that we can see her face, but only obliquely. Trial viewers, when I was making this work, have asked, why can't we see her face? Well, the impossibility for visitors to look her in the eyes, whereas her captive father constantly does so, is the visualization of her captivity. And you will see a scene where you see her from behind and the father from the front with a totally still face. It's a moving image of stillness. In Ebba Soon's artwork, we cannot only look her in the eyes, we cannot look her in the eyes either, because the face is impenetrable. The scene as a whole declines contact. It suspends its possibility. Both the craving for it and the imprisonment that prohibits it compel the desire in viewers to overcome those difficulties. The trial viewers' complaint was not a misreading of the scene, but a frustration that approximates them to the state in which the figure is caught. An incipient empathy. So the filming, the mode of filming, made it appealing for visitors to feel that same captivity. And that was the whole, the goal. Now, here's another picture. The second photograph, I'll do 4 in total, of Ebba Soon. And that being alone is more than lacking the social bond that nurtures life. Traumatized persons, because they cannot even consciously recall the trauma-inducing violence, are also locked up, alone within themselves. And that makes them vulnerable for the assaults of trauma, which they cannot master by the narrativity of memory. Instead, these become a drama inflicted on them. The trauma assaults you. And this was theorized by Freud's contemporary Pierre Janet. We always think psychoanalysis is Freud, but there were others, and Pierre Janet was a very important one. Instead of repression, Janet proposed more attention to dissociation, not putting it back in the depth of the unconscious, but putting it on the side. In narratological terms, repression results in ellipsis. the omission of elements in the narrative. But dissociation instead doubles the strength of the narrative series of events by splitting them off into a sideline called parallapsis. Is Matthew here? We talked about that yesterday. Repression interrupts the flow of narratives that shape memory, whereas dissociation splits off material that cannot be integrated into the main narrative. Hence, the hecticity of narrative in Don Quixote, because it's all there, but on the side, and he tries to recuperate it, but he cannot. The figure seems locked up in this picture in a dark, grotto-like space, and he is alone within himself. The space is a metaphor of his mind. The near monochrome image presents his loneliness in the combination of his slightly opened lips and the turn of the head to a possible outside. His eyes, like Zoraida's, show craving, but at the same time without much hope. The point of light in his eyes and the tip on the tip of his nose do suggest that there is an opening in the wall next to him on the right side, which there was. Even the hairs on his chin capture the light. The delicate balance of light and dark, with light behind him as if he is pushed inside the prison, and then the suggested light on his side, this composition is a collaborative work fitting the idea of authorship as multiple. And this is one of my paralyptic side issues that I want to keep discussing, the collective authorship. It was staged by cinematographer Jonas Valterson, also a young student in Wecker, who was painstakingly walking backwards in an impossibly narrow space while directing the actor. And there was no space for me as the director of the film, so I just had to stay outside. And then it was recreated by Ebba Sund for this still image. So that's 3 authors together, with the actor included. The author, the photographer, and the cinematographer. Now, this is my total favorite in this context of trauma. Another work by Ebba Sund that I consider a masterpiece of the adequate presentation, not representation, but presentation of trauma that avoids all the pitfalls. This became the poster image of the Don Quixote exhibition. We don't have a poster here, but in the other shows we had one, and it was based on this photo. It's not a representation of a traumatized person. Yet it is an image of trauma. What can that be? An image of trauma. That's the question of aesthetic and Cantonese. It is as such that this is again the work of collective authorship. This time I just told the actor to look traumatized. I didn't have to tell him. He did that all the time. And the photographer, Ebba, to capture that. So, you do it, you capture it, and I stood by. But they both did so much more. Additionally, the set itself was also a co-author. Like the cave, like narrow space, the prison suggesting iron lattice was just there as elements of an old ruined castle. So this was all in a ruined castle from the pre-Renaissance times. The slot ruin in Kronoberg in Småland in Sweden. And the cropping suggests a much larger grid with the doors entirely consisting of iron bars. And this out-of-frame, hors-champ, extension augments the effect of enclosure and even affects the separating contraption. But on the right, we can see that the door is already on its way open. It's a bit open here. It's not quite attached. Or it might be on its way to be closed and the captive just being captured at this moment. Open question. This ambiguity is a sign of intermediality, since it intimates movement. There is another ambiguity, the slow transformation in the focus from the blurred on the right to the sharp on the left that shows a hesitation between 3 and 2 dimensionality. This situates the image between the environment of the set and the flatness of photography. So this is a really sort of creative intermediality. Now the oblique angles establishes a contrast between the letters and the face of the captive. The face is starkly frontal, whereas in the previous image of the captive was tragically alone. Here he's not entirely alone within himself. He has an incipient interlocutor. No, he cannot speak. His mouth is covered by the letters. His moustache shows a bit above and his beard below it, so that the absence of the mouth is more strongly suggested. Meaning he cannot speak. He cannot tell about the horror of slavery, because that's dissociated. The captivity, forced labor that he has had to endure years on end without knowing he would ever get out. But then, what is the point of that contrast between oblique and straightforward frontality? His eyes say it all. He cannot speak, because he cannot narrate what happened to him, but the image says he can look at you. Look you in the face and implore you to fulfill his desire, life-giving, life-saving, to have an interlocutor, to have a second person. The eyes look at us imploringly, but also deeply sad. According to Cervantes' embedded story of the captive, in the end he manages to escape. And this is not, emphatically not, based on autobiography. Thanks to a fairy tale fantasy that separates it very clearly from the evoked autobiography, and that is through the woman Zoraida. In a convoluted story, Zoraida helps him escape and escapes with him. In the exhibition project, we simplified this, avoiding the excessively fantastic narrative, which risks visually distracting from the primary imaging act. Among the reasons for this slimming down of the scene was the need to leave the traumatized state of the captive intact, so that the subtle shifts from an incipient instauration of the narrative power over the self could be shown, but very subtly. For trauma doesn't simply go away. But narratively, in Soon's photograph of the next moment, we receive an answer to the question the ambiguity of the previous photograph posed. Is the door about to open or to close? Here, the perspectival lines go in the opposite direction, from left to right. And this tells us that the previous image was made from the outside, where this one was taken from the inside. So now we see that the makers were the captives, and he escapes. We see the captive moving away from the apparent interlocutors in order to escape and turn his back to us. And you see the energy in the body. Moreover, his body is sharply in focus, whereas the letters is blurry. And this indicates that now the one who is striving to become master of the story is running away, and the ones busy capturing the view are locked inside the prison. A kind of involuntary identification. The captive is running to his freedom, indicated by the straight line of the forest on the other side of the lake. That lake might be the obstacle, the expanse of water that makes access to the other side of freedom still a way off, an allusion to the sea in the novel. But his clutched fist and the determined body pose indicate that he will not give up. He is running away. He is already outside, and the outside, which the lake and the forest signify, opposed as they are to the bars of the prison. That is also something that this image produces, that we understand. Soon's play with perspective, with the ambiguity between two- and three-dimensionality, resonates perfectly with the previous image. The ostentatious frontality of the face, half hidden as it is, resonates with the straight line in the distance in this one, if you compare the two images. There his eyes were his tools to solicit empathy. Here they are invisible, since he has turned his back to us, but we can trust they are sharply focusing on that other side of freedom. The blurred letters separates us from the sharply focused ex-captive, ex or not. as the darkness of the black iron contrasts with the fresh green grass outside. Now, I have alleged these photographs as visual poetic reflections on the issue that Cervantes' novel so poignantly and brilliantly presented in the form of formlessness. And this is my reading of his novel, and its enduring relevance. And I thank you for your interest and attention, and I hope that you will give the exhibition the durational, intense focus it deserves and needs, so that you can think through the impact of images as moving, which help you changing your thoughts. And that is how the erkenntnis is produced by images. So I hope to see the exhibition by your own students also today. Thank you very much. And I will, while we have a little Q&A, I will keep this information on the screen, which is where the passwords for the films and all that are presented. So you can plunder that.
So thank you very much, Mieke. And you have agreed to take a few questions
yes,
from
that's
the
why
audience
I stopped
here in Zurich before we can see the exhibition, the installation. And of course, we have the privilege, opposed to the online audience, to really see it as an installation, not just the videos. And you've explained why that is so important to have this specific time-space arrangement. And I guess that after we've seen the installation, there will be more questions and more comments, and there will be, of course, an opportunity to talk to you. But if there are questions now, you are very welcome to address them to Mieke. So, looking at you, and as usually, it's in the keynote context, people are afraid to come forward and ask.
Don't be afraid. I don't bite.
Oh gosh, the storm is coming. We heard the thunder loudly. Okay, so if there are no immediate...
There's a question.
Yeah?
Yes?
Please.
Oh, go ahead. I'm always glad for questions. That's when I learn, huh? That's my reward. Yes.
Well, maybe it's not really a question, I have to apologize, but it's that I want to express my gratefulness because I understood something with your presentation, which I wasn't aware about because I talked about an Inuit musician who actually committed suicide lately, and the way how you stressed empathy and that Don Quixote looks at us to tell the story of people who cannot tell the story. That's something that I find, for me really mind-opening to see this in your artwork, and I'm very much looking forward now to the installation because I really understood more than I could with the help of theory so far. Thank you.
Thank you. That was not a question, right? Thank you very much. That's a very kind comment, and I hope that you will not be disappointed.
Thank you very much for your talk. Well, that was theatrical, wasn't it? The thunder. And I hope I can make it 2 questions and not just comments. The first question has to do with the quote you gave from Kati Röttger, where you said, theatrality had to do with changes in the material basis of linguistic behavior. And I'm very much interested in how we can understand the material basis here, because obviously that's what you're trying to do when you try to speak about how images can afford us a kind of knowledge that's not the knowledge of linguistic of linguistic narrative. And that leads me to the second question, which is more difficult, and I apologize in advance for making it a little more dramatic than it needs to be. I am worried about using trauma in the way you do, because I think it gives us an idea that, trauma is something completely out of the ordinary. And I I just think that what you're trying to express with Cervantes and with, Wittgenstein and other people is that something does not come into view when we do not consider a sort of disturbance in the way we usually order things. So basically this materiality that affords us a glimpse, comes from a disturbance that you can see in trauma. Did I understand that right?
Thank you. Those are two very important questions. I'll do them in this order. I'll address them in this order. The material basis that I try to modify in the Munch exhibition is about time. And time is something that's really difficult. It doesn't have a form, but it's with us all the time. Hence the expression all the time. And the material basis to put seating in an exhibition, that's material. You need those objects. And it was a little bit of negotiating with the Munch staff to get these benches done, but when they understood why I wanted them, they immediately said yes. And that was really good, because they were very afraid that chairs would make the paintings vulnerable, because they've had a very bad break in there. And I said, oh, then don't do chairs, but do benches. Solid oak benches, and they did it. And that made the whole experience of the visitors completely different. And not only for the older ones like myself, who get really tired in the knees and the back, teenagers were sitting for hours in front of a painting. And I said, what are you seeing here? And she started to analyze the painting. It was a 14-year-old school kid. And she was and I went away, I came back after an hour, and she was 2 benches to the right, still watching the paintings. And paintings I never watched in that material intensity. And that is, I think, really important. And so it's the materiality, the temporality, the relationship. So I put the paintings low, so that from the benches you saw them on eye level, and that was very important. And it made it also a little disturbing to be standing and look from higher up. And so the people who were tempted to stay and go fast ended up sitting down too. Now, then you would think, oh, the museum has lost a lot of money because less tickets were sold. No, on the contrary. There were more tickets sold, because this went like fire through the media, and it was a big hit. But that's another thing. The material basis of the seating is about time. And time is something that is neither material nor formal, but it is. It is material in a way. But it's hard to define exactly what it is. Now, the issue of trauma, I totally understand your hesitation, because trauma is a very sensitive issue. And I wanted to bring it up. And the fantastic biography of Cervantes in Algiers during those 5.5 years that Maria Antonia Garcés wrote, award-winning biography. And I don't like biography. I never read biographies. But since I had known her, I read it and I thought, wow, this explains the formlessness of the form. And explaining doesn't mean showing, but creating in a way. It created a form that made the trauma accessible for empathy, not for seeing it. You don't get to see him, in the slavery. In the novel also, it's very modest, it's very discreet. You hear that he has to do things, but there's no cruelty performed on him, at least, that is described. The point is that you can feel the traumatized quality in the prose, in the repetitions, in the formlessness, and I think it is important for us as participants, readers, to be induced to the empathy that traumatized people need. Because the work by Françoise Davoine that I have been evoking here, she is a psychoanalyst in Paris and working with traumatized people. And her work is successful in the sense that she does get them out of the hospital, off the drugs, back to work. Of course, it takes time, but she manages that. And that is thanks to her empathy that Freud would completely refuse. Freud did not accept the empathy of the analyst. And so she is not a classical psychoanalyst, but she is classical enough to know Freud inside out and to argue with him. And it is amazing how successful that is once you realize that the violence-induced traumas come from social violence, social misery, social, like hunger, war, rape, abuse. Those are the causes. And if you then say, oh, they cannot be helped, give them drugs, turn them into zombies, put them in a hospital, you're not helping. So that's why I think it is important to bring this up. And I try to bring it up by suggesting it without representing it. And not the whole work is about trauma, but I chose trauma because it's the most difficult aspect of something social that we need to know and understand, because I wanted to do something about knowledge producing art, how art can produce knowledge, that is not about the truth in the mathematical sense, but it's about people who are miserable. We see them being miserable, and instead of turning a corner and avoid the crazies on the street, you can do something. And that is what I wanted to convey with the project and with the talk. Okay?
One more question. Yeah, thank you for your interesting lecture, and I like it very much, your thinking about trauma and empathy, and also in relationship to societal praxis. But I have a question to the last part of the lecture when you explained us the images.
Yes.
And so I asked myself, if it was it not in a very explicit way to say us, you can say in a discursive way, what the meaning of these images is. And so I was a little bit, I was wondering about your own thesis that there's a difference between how images, you can say, what they do with us and the discourses. So I saw some explicit messages which you explained, like an iconology, some signs for trauma, for example. And I saw also middle-class people, academic middle-class people. So I saw also different other aspects. And I think that's the way in which, for example, design or publicity very often works to create a message. And then I heard your point about how different images works. And so my question is, I didn't understand what is the difference, because you're talking about the images. For me, it was really narrative, discursive way to explain us.
Yeah, thank you. I completely understand. You are resisting my attempt to explain the images, because then I'm replacing them with discourse. And so I fall back on the academic response. But I didn't mean to do that, and I'm very sorry if that had that effect. I didn't mean to shut you up with your own views of the images. I wanted to validate this collaborative work by a very young student who made these images that I think, I mean, I was in awe when I got them. And I thought, I can't believe, did you do this? And yes, she did. And I asked her questions about it, and she had no, she would not confirm what I said about them. So she would be on your side as the maker and say, let me look at these images. So, of course, this is the problem. I'm asked here to give a lecture, and so I'm asked to step into an academic role, but I'm making an argument about visual art. And that visual art, I think, it doesn't need my lecture. We could have said, you know, at 9:30 after Dieter was finished, we could say, let's go and let that drop. But the reflection on how the art brings up knowledge, and that's what I was trying to convey through the analysis of the scene of the narrative Stuttering about the trauma, and then through these photographs that I think are absolutely brilliantly knowledge producing. And I was just giving my interpretation of how they did that. So I should have said that more explicitly, but it was not so, this is how you have to see it. You see it the way you see it, but for me, the additional value of these images as knowledge producing, and that was my assignment for the lecture, that I had no other way than to show it and to point it out. Was that? I know it's a bit lame as an excuse, but...
So thank you very much, Mieke Baal, again, for this wonderful, tremendous opening of our conference. I think it was a really perfect starting point.
Thank you.
And as I mentioned before, this keynote has two parts. One was the discursive part. The other one is the exhibition. You mentioned before in your presentation Wittgenstein and the difference between saying and showing, or rather the entanglement between saying and showing. And I consider myself this as crucial for the understanding of the impact of aesthetics, because there's a certain inescapability of aesthetics in every cultural practices, because there's this part of showing, which cannot, that we cannot express in another way than just again showing. But showing, as you know, has manifold meanings. One is, of course, this gesture to show on something, but also to manifest something, and also to perform something, and to exhibit something. And with this, I would like to open this exhibition. So please take your time, because time is crucial
of the essence
for this exhibition. Take your own way through the exhibition, create your narrative through the parkour, and also the empathy.
Yes.
Create your empathy by looking at the images and the exhibition. So thank you again, and
thank you, Dieter.
I would like to invite you to the Aktionsraum, where you can have a look at the exhibition. Thank you.